heavy metals in water. That's typically something there's a lot of naturally present heavy metals like mercury and arsenic. Mining can also introduce different heavy metals at levels that are higher than natural baseline. And agricultural runoff can be a good thing to a point because it provides nutrients, but there's other things that, with too many nutrients, you can get situations where you get big algae blooms, and then the algae can die and absorb all the oxygen and have fish die-offs. So, talked about their fish habitat at kind of a broad scale, and then what's important at the smaller scale, and how all these different fish have different life history strategies and use these different habitats in different ways during different seasons. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the types of disturbance that affect fish habitat. There's natural disturbances, which are sometimes called pulse disturbances, meaning they just, typically a natural disturbance, not always, but typically happens rapidly, and it can be of large magnitude, but then it sort of dissipates and things sort of start to go back to their original state, move in that direction anyway. So this is example of a pulse where a wildfire moves through. This was from this is just a huge, large debris jam created by an avalanche. Put all these trees into the river. This is a mudslide that came off of a slope, and a lot of this material went into the river. This was another big mudslide. This was the culvert on the road that it buried, so it was a lot of debris, but a kind of a combination of lots of different types of debris. So they tend to happen, boom, and then the system starts to adjust. And here's one more example of this. Was from last year. We had a lot of avalanches that came down around Yellow Pine, brought a lot of woody debris into the channel. As opposed to human-related disturbances, which tend to be more of a chronic. They may not be as large of magnitude, but they tend to be chronic, and so a small input over a long period of time. Oops. So here's some examples like of sediment coming off of a road. It's just a wet, kind of muddy road, and you get turbid water with sediment running into the creek. It's not nearly the magnitude of a huge mudslide going into the river, but it's just chronic year in, year out, and it's also very limited in general to one size of sediment, being this fine sediment, rather than a mudslide will bring in a mix of big boulders and gravel and trees and all this stuff that actually, it's going to have some temporary negative impacts, but it's also going to introduce a lot of that habitat complexity I was talking about, wood and big boulders. And another example of a road that just was in a bad location and not maintained, and so stream basically jumped on the road and eroded away sediment. So I work for the Forest Service, and so our job is to manage the land and to try to find that multiple use balance, allowing for different activities like recreation and motorized and non-motorized use. We have some vegetation management, timber sales, grazing, all those things. So our job is to allow those activities, but also try to be good stewards of the land and minimize the impacts or improve conditions where we can over where they were if they've been altered. So showed you a couple examples of what can happen when roads were historically placed in a bad location. Well, if we don't need that road anymore because there's another road in a better location, something we can do is basically just get rid of that road. This is the stream right here. and obliterate it and restore that function. We used to put a lot of culverts in without thinking a whole lot of, kind of like we did with dams, without thinking a lot about the fish and whether they needed to get upstream. So we have, there's fewer and fewer, but we had a lot of these culverts that were barriers. This is a little red band trout trying to jump up into this culvert. They just can't jump high enough, and then once they get in it, they can't swim fast enough to get through the culvert. And I remember I talked about how fish use these, there's some that migrate, some are resident. They use these really, a lot of diversity in the types of habitat they use. Well, if we cut off all those places where they can go spawn, they have a narrower area where they can live. This is one place where we fragmented their habitat. So what we do, something like that, which is just replace it with a culvert that basically simulates a stream, and they can get right through that. And its added benefit too is that a lot of times these older culverts, if we had a big flood event, which happens all the time, happens pretty regularly, they would be too small and they would potentially fail, and the whole road would wash out. Where this one will pass even a flood that would only happen every 100 years or so. Some examples of logging. This was a salvage logging wasn't on national forest, but this was a skid road that was put in to log it, and on a steep slope, and you're just going to get a lot of erosion. So this is an example where we did salvage logging where we didn't get really any erosion because we did it over on flat ground and when it was frozen. This is a diversion where there's water rights, state water rights to divert water down a ditch. It ends up dewatering the channel and not providing a lot of habitat for fish, and also some of the fish were getting sucked down the ditch where they would not be able to get back out of the ditch. So kind of a compromise is you put in a fish screen that shunts water and fish back down into the channel, and in this case the irrigators gave up a small portion of their water right to allow some water to go back into the channel so that it was not just dry. And here's some examples of, this was a pasture that was overgrazed, just had too many cows on it for too long of a period. So we didn't eliminate grazing, we just fenced off this particular pasture. There's plenty of areas around there that they could utilize, but they just wanted to hang out here. So fenced it off, didn't really have to do much, and in 10 years it looked like this. This is another example of, this is real simple habitat. It's just kind of, there's no cover, there's no shade, it's just kind of, if you're a fish, there's nowhere to hide. It's all silty, there's not, gravel, and compared to this, which is, there's undercut banks and a deeper pool. I went back to this particular stream in fall one year, and there was 50 bull trout in one pool just upstream of that. Another example of just when habitat can get kind of simplified and widening and shallowing compared to what looks like just upstream if you manage it a little more carefully. So motorized recreation, it's another very highly valued sort of resource on national forests. This is an ATV trail, but you're getting a lot of erosion coming down the road, and driving right through the creek creates turbidity, or you could have spawning fish right in the stream. So we can do things like build bridges to allow that access, have some riparian function, keep people out of the reds, reduce turbidity. Mining, so water quality. This is a red ledge mine in Deep Creek down by Hell's Canyon. This is acid drainage coming out of this adit. So all the kind of pretty orange color is basically heavy metals that precipitate out. It's really low pH coming out of there, and high pH coming out of there, so you get all these metals that are in solution, and then when it hits fresher water, the pH goes back down and these metals precipitate out. So why is that color? These are just some, attempts of reclamation following mining. This is the Stibnite pit. This is the lightning pit, which is that color because of zinc, and it's about the pH of a cup of coffee. So there's mineral resources, everybody uses them. There's a lot more technical challenges to trying to restore things like this. That's why this one is still out there on the landscape. It's expensive and technically very challenging. So, as a Forest Service biologist, talked about the fish and their habitat and some of the things that affect the habitat. So one important thing that the Forest Service is involved in is monitoring their fish habitat, and Dave's going to talk more about this. But just this was some old school monitoring where now we snorkel. Every once in a while we'll use hook and line or actually electrofish. This was a technique that was used. It was very effective, but they used explosives to count fish. So monitoring, we snorkel, figure out fish distribution. This little bull trout, counting where salmon are spawning, keeping track of the salmon. We keep track of their habitat, how much fine sediment is in the habitat, which Dave will talk a little bit about. And as far as we talked about how we have these management activities and we try to minimize the impacts, we'll use that monitoring information to try to assess what the current condition of their habitat is. And then if we have a proposed project, we try to design that project so that it minimizes the effects of their habitat, or we even improve it. If our data shows us that the habitat is not in the condition that we'd like it to be, we can propose things to improve it, like those culverts or things like that. So that's the end, but there's more. As everybody likes to talk about the salmonids, I talked about a few of the other fish, but there is a lot more going on out there other than just the salmon and trout. There's the sculpin. There are these guys, which are large-scale suckers, and if you ever get a chance, this is pretty cool. If you go up to, some of you probably have seen the suckers spawning in the river above the lake in June, but there are thousands of them. These are large-scale suckers. I mean, they're literally, if you float down through there, there's literally thousands covering the bottom of the river. I was watching this and I started to think, with that many fish, I wonder how much of and they swim along and they suck on these rocks to try to get food, insects and detritus, and how much they turn the gravel over. That many fish feeding while they're up there. These fish, you'll watch them. The males will chase, a group of males will chase a female around and kind of swarm around her, and then she'll just kind of broadcast her eggs on the bottom and on vegetation. But I don't know where they must. I know they've done some studies on large scale suckers, and they do in some cases migrate quite a ways, but I've never. You don't see the juveniles in the river, so I don't know what happens if they just bail it back to the lake right after they hatch, or there's not much in that river upstream of the lake as far as fish goes, other than when these are spawning and maybe a few kokanee that I've seen snorkeling. And those real bright colors, those are kind of spawning colors with stripes. One last slide. And there's some other critters out there, spotted frogs, western pearl mussels, which are a really neat, whole nother story. This is a tail frog larvae that live on the bottom and suck on algae off the rocks. Caddis, all the insects. These guys make this little case like a caterpillar would.
In case you like to eat mussels, don't bother with these. The Indians used to eat them, but I've tried and they're really not worth it.
And then this little guy made the newspaper recently when there was a high school gal in Boise who proposed to the state legislature that this be the state amphibian. It's the Idaho giant salamander, and she got shut down for the third time. She's been trying since she was in kindergarten or something, but they're a pretty cool little.
And the reason she got shut down was the legislators widely said, if we make it a state amphibian, the EPA may come down on us and make us protect it.
Yeah. But they're neat. Well, that's all I have.
Yeah, it would cost money.
Any questions?
Can you tell us the story about Cascade Reservoir and how they were having, is somebody gonna talk about that, how they were having a big fish problem and they were thinking about at one time draining the lake or then poisoning the lake and then whatever happened with all that?
Maybe Dave, he gives more history on.
Well, Cascade's really a shallow reservoir. The maximum depth's only 30 feet. And so it's also got a long wind catchment and it picks up the bottom of the reservoir. So any nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen that are in there historically got picked up and turned around, and that's why it was so good for fishing until the early 90s. It was really productive, but none of the, well, almost all the nutrients that get flushed into there from upriver deposit out in the reservoir and then are continually picked up into the water column. And so it took a long time after the reservoir was built before enough accumulated to become a problem. But then it started creating algae blooms that were, number one, toxic in their own right, and number two, when they decayed in the river or in the reservoir, they produced anaerobic conditions below what's the thermocline, where the temperature changes partway down in the depth of the reservoir, and so there was no oxygen in the cooler part of the reservoir. So in the mid-90s, basically all the rainbows down there and almost everything else died. I don't remember if you recall it, but there were some, even some news footage of some of the tributaries like Poison Creek that showed literally thousands and thousands of rainbow trout around 20 inches trying to get out of the reservoir where there was no oxygen and get into the streams. And of course, when that many fish got in the streams, they took all the oxygen out of the streams, so they all died in the streams. And so Fish and Game considered doing a lot of things, including draining the reservoir. And it's still not in very good shape, but in the intervening years, the nutrient levels in the